We can begin with the usual prayer. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karavavahi Tejasvinavaditam Astuma Vidvishavai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May that one protect us both. May that one nourish us. May our study be full of vigor and illumination. May we not unnecessarily cavil with each other. Peace, peace, peace be on them all. So this is the Vedanta Series question and answer. If there are no questions, there are no answers. So let us pause a little bit, and you should feel free to ask a question, and we can try and make it more interactive. What that means is that if you feel like interrupting, you're free to do so. I just have to watch out for that. And then if I'm in a certain flow answering a question, feel free to pose your questions in the chat also. Right.
Swami,
yes.
I don't know if it's a question, maybe I shouldn't even bother mentioning it, but if you could say something about the self-effulgence, or, you know, partly of what I'm trying to get at is, you know, if the illumination of our, you know, of our body and mind and intellect is ultimately energized or vitalized by the self, how can the intellect ever, you know, have any, you know, it can't will, it can't activate knowing the self, since the self is the thing that's energizing or vitalizing it in the first place. So where does that leave the individual Jivatman?
Okay.
I don't know if that's clear enough. Maybe that's
yes, all good, all good. All right, so firstly, we have to understand what is Jivatman. So we have to understand what is Jivatman first. What is the Jiva? So that's the first aspect that we have to deal with. When we say Jiva, what we're talking about, Jiva itself means life, a thing that gives life, or a thing that is lively. You ask a question, what is life? You're really essentially asking, in connection with the human, you're asking, you know, what am I as a living, breathing, and conscious, intelligent entity? So that's the same kind of question that we're asking. Okay, so you're asking about the intellect. Technically, we have to call this intellect buddhi. Buddhi, one of enlightened intellect, is Buddha. So the reason why Gautama Siddhartha, or the Shakyamuni, the silent one of the Shakya clan, was Buddha, it was describing his condition, basically, one of enlightened mind. That means the enlightened intellect, which is the determinative faculty that we have. But we have to understand the geography of the mind. And for that, we have to resort to Sankhya. All of the Vedanta philosophy acknowledges Sankhya in terms of its categorization. And Sankhya itself means it. So the categorization is there, but the final conclusion of the Sankhya's we don't agree with. The Sankhya's found it a generous thing to take the whole of nature, the whole of life, and put it into one category, and this they call prakriti, roughly nature. Now, Sankhya is an atheistic system, and so we won't identify this prakriti with God. And a question yesterday in terms of the Upanishads was, is there scope for Ishvara, this personal God, in the non-dualistic Advaitic system? And I pointed out very carefully, yes. You can't say that if I want to go to Galway, then I have to eliminate some place, intermediate place in between. So I forget what the intermediate place is. It'll come to me now. If you go to Galway, you take any example you like. You have to pass through something, you pass through something anyway. So the determinative faculty is together with 5 organs of perception, the organs of sight and hearing and touch and taste and so on, is how we know the world. So supposing we declare that there is a world, then with all our plans and programs and adjustments, we have to ask this question, how do we know there is a world? And to most people, it doesn't occur to them to ask this question. But of course, the answer is that we register its existence through the 5 sense organs that we have. And in relation to that, there are 5 objects on the other side for us to register. And if we had more sense organs, the world would look very different. If we had the capacity for X-ray vision, then I'd have to compliment you on your marvelous bone structure. So the eyes give me color and shape, and the ears give me sounds. The skin gives me a sense of pressures, touch, tongue, taste, nose, smell. These are the 5 basic gateways, if you like, 5 photographs that we have of the universe. And that's seemingly outside us. They're fitted to a body, which we call our body. It has a way of sustaining itself. But there was a time when this body never existed. We understand that from people who come and go. And we understand also that there is a time when a woman is pregnant. There was a time when my mother, yours, was pregnant. In which case we have to ask, this invisible entity, where was that? Well, we know where it was physically, but before that, where was it? So these are very good and necessary questions. The shape of the mother's body is inclined to give the baby, the fetus that is inside, some nourishment. And in all probability, her thoughts will also shape the character of the baby. We know this through scientific research, by the way. The most important years of your life or time period of your life are the 9 months that you sat in the mother's womb. So if the mother could regulate thoughts, if she could conduct things in a pristine and beautiful, thoughtful way, no negativity there, all a joyful environment, a protected environment, some environment that would be truthful, some environment that would have joy and truthfulness and purity and love and harmony and all those qualities, then would the baby inside develop in the same way? And the likelihood is yes. In the same way that if the mother smokes or does anything that is physically damaging, the baby also gets it. For 9 months, the baby and the mother, to an extent, are separate entities. So we have to ask, what is this entity before all of that happened, and where was it as such? And then we have to resort to what we call jiva. That is the determinative faculty together with the 5 organs of perception. And this constitutes, in the Taittiriya Upanishad, something that is called Vijnana Maya Kosha. That is a sheath that abounds in intelligence. It is pure consciousness limited only by what we call upadhi. Upadhi is a limiting factor. It's normally registered in translation as a limiting adjunct, something that is proximate to something that limits its potential. So while the immortal self, the Atman, is shining, as it were, is consciousness itself, when you put something adjacent to it, it seems as if that thing itself is shining. Do you have some example of that? Yes. Supposing we understand and take for granted that invisible all around is the electromagnetic wave system in which is contained photons, particles of light. harnessed with electrons. Electricity is there, invisible, carried at a certain frequency, a certain wavelength. Now, knowing all those facts about it, we can direct all the electrons in a certain way, certain direction, that's called electricity. And with that current being supplied, that won't give us light. We have to put a light bulb to it. When we put the light bulb to it, we get this light. Mistakenly, we could say, this light bulb is intelligent. This light bulb is full of light. This light bulb is shining. But the light bulb itself could contain certain parts. Filament has to be there, for example. It has to be protected. Glass has to protect it. But there has to be a connectedness. So consciousness plus the limiting adjunct, which is a sheath, appears as a phenomenal being, which we call an individual soul, Jiva. And on account of that limitation, the Jiva forgets its true nature of infinity. It identifies with this light bulb. And so the true nature of infinity and blessedness is lost to it. It feels that it is an agent or a doer. That's the difficulty. It feels that it is an enjoyer or an experiencer. And so it becomes happy or it becomes miserable. These two, among other options, are available. And it is therefore bound by a causal law that we call karma. It is also subject to transmigration. It assumes a higher or lower body. And that's what happens prior to the pregnancy. The assumption is there. With an intelligence inbuilt and an experience inbuilt. If this wasn't the case, how is it that a single zygote, one single cell, that develops with one DNA instruction, develops into different multiple cells, all with different instructions, all with different functions. Liver cell is there separate, brain cell is there separate, all these various cells are separate. How is it that's a marvel that actually modern science is still scratching their head over? But we have the answer. Inside is an inbuilt, unseen set of instructions that moves us forward with one agenda in its mind, self-discovery. So it can be stated that there are two Vedantic theories regarding the Jiva. And we find this in different schools of thought. According to the one, pure consciousness just appears reflected in, but not limited by, this Vijnana Maya Kosha, this sheath of intelligence. That's the one idea. The reflection itself is the Jiva. And the reflection assumes, of course, the characteristics of the medium in which the object is reflected. So there's every reason why in the psyche we have an urge toward joy, an urge toward pleasure, because our nature is bliss. There's every reason why the entire Jiva wants to survive at all costs. In the COVID situation, that's the idea. Please survive at all costs. And the medical practitioners take this up and they say, we want to allow people to survive at all costs. I might be on my last legs. I might be breathing. I might wish to depart. Modern science tells me, no, you're not allowed. Let's keep you going at all costs. Unless I specify in a will or something, please don't put me on a life support or something like that. Or please let me go nicely. This is the difficulty. So this great, great urge to cling on to life is there. In the Patanjali Yoga Sutras, this is identified as one of the kleshas, that is, one of the obstacles. Now, the thing about an obstacle is just a thing in the way. It's not part of the nature of things. Even an example. Yes? Supposing there is a huge dam in Zimbabwe. Kariba Dam is, I think, the largest man-made dam, that is lake in the world. Not dam wall, but the lake. So what is holding this body of water back is a wall, but that wall has a number of gates in. And when the necessity arises, you can open a gate, and just like a whole glorious, immense and loud fountain, the water spurts forth with a great roar and adds to the river beyond it. In this same way, there are obstacles within us. But the primary obstacle really is ignorance of the fact of our own immortal self. Is it always there? No, it's not always there. If you remove all the conditions, it shines in its own glory. It is not at all restricted. For this reason, these upadhis or limiting junctures can also be called manifesting adapters. Let's take the example again of a light bulb. A light bulb, on the one hand, from the electricity's point of view, you ask electricity, what is happening at this point? My full glory is being restricted. You ask on the other side of it, my full glory is being manifested. So it's this manifested side of things where we have this expression of what is already there and an explanation for why the manifested portion is like it is. If our nature was not pure existence, we would not wish to exist. If our nature was not pure bliss, we would not want joy. And if our nature was not to survive, that is to be useful, to manifest all the energy which is there and express it through all the functions that we have, all the upadhis that we have, the expressive side of things, then we couldn't say that our nature was consciousness. So the reflection of the sun in water appears to be still or moving. That's an example that is usually given according to the condition of the water. If the water is still, it seems to be still. If the water is moving, it seems to be moving. Same with the mind. So in the same way, consciousness is reflected in this vijnanamaya kosha and becomes endowed with the characteristics of this buddhi, this intellect. So that's the one thing. Then another theory, that the jiva is like being seen as a dream. Now, none of these are contradictory. The different perspectives, that's all. So the pure consciousness that Vedanta calls Brahman, under the influence of something that is called Maya. Maya means a fact of paradox. Things are impermanent, changing, moving, but our interpretation is they are permanent and unmoving. Things appear and disappear. Our interpretation is things are static. This whole earth seems to be like that. But when we analyze it from a scientific point of view, astrophysical point of view, we can see that we're all rotating at enormous speeds. Something like 200 miles a second or something more, maybe more, if you collectively put it. Whatever it is, the earth itself is spinning. We only register it as the rise and set of the sun, or the change of time as registered in solar units. What you see as a clock is only an imitation of the sun's movement. And then that whole earth, planet Earth, is rotating around the sun, moving around the sun. We can calculate all of that, and then that whole solar system is trying to get back into the center of the galaxy. And the whole thing is ruled on frustration. So I often tell you, you see, a small stream you can observe wants to get to the sea, but all the rocks and winding turns and so on are in the way. All the obstacles are in the way, and it gets frustrated. So what we call kleshas or obstacles are inbuilt frustrations. And then, but it need not be there because our internal nature is pure and full and free. But these obstacles are only apparent obstacles. They're only there in a form of appearance. Difficult to grasp the whole idea until we understand that built into the Vedanta are these three states of consciousness. Four, if you include the fourth, Turiya, the observer that never goes anywhere. And so all these three states of consciousness are not separate to pure consciousness itself, but expressions. And what is the upardi? Maya. Maya is the adapter, the overall adapter. Now, when you increase this, when you extrapolate all of this to the whole universe, how did the universe come about? It came about by introducing an upardi, a restricting, limiting factor, or put in the other way, an expressive manifesting adapter. And so this limiting juncture limits this Brahman. How can you limit Brahman? No, we're just talking. It's just words. We are restricted by our descriptive capacity. So we have to introduce some additional words, just for clarification and accuracy. Seems to be limited, appears to be limited. This is the only language we can use. And that appearance we call Maya. And Maya is equated to nature. And the first thing that happens from it is with the cooperation of three component parts, three qualities, three substantial qualities. We call this Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. And the Sattva portion is the creative portion. And the Rajasic portion is the projecting portion. And the Tamas is the thing that inserts static nature on us. Seems to hide everything. Hiding portion, projecting portion, revealing portion. And it is with the help of this creative portion that we get a cosmic mind. It is this cosmic mind then that combines and recombines, for want of a better word, its active creative thought. That becomes the universe for us. What is the way out of it? How do we get back to this pristine nature? We have to go backwards. We have to go into a devolution. So we have to, as it were, collapse the objects of the senses into the senses, internal senses. It is, we think the senses are external, it's just the organs. But internal to that are the senses that are replayed in dream or imagination. And that then gets devolved, ultimately, into the very subtle elements of nature and life. And that gets devolved a little further into this cosmic mind, what we call buddhi. And that gets devolved further into this pristine thing that we call prakriti or nature. And that then, once that is all clear, that we have a revelation then, that is our pure nature. And the process of doing it is collectively called cleaning the mind. So cleaning the buddhi, cleaning the intellect, and directing it properly creates an inkling of that which sits behind it, a suggestion of that which sits behind it, until the final obstacle is gone. So this Brahman or consciousness, and the influence of this upardi, this limiting adjunct Maya, dreams, as it were, that it has become a man or an animal or an inanimate object. But all of these regarding the nature of Jiva agree that this Brahman appears as the Jiva, and all on account of Maya. The jivahood of the infinite Atman is due to this upadhi, this vijnana maya kosha. It's apparent. It's not real. And so when we look at all the characteristics of birth and death and disease and decay and all the things, and happiness and unhappiness and so on, ascribed to this jiva, these are all unreal from the standpoint of Brahman. They are not there, they go away. Like if I want to look at the stars, I can look at them through a telescope. That's our normal position in the waking state. Then I can look at the telescope, at the mind itself, if the telescope represents the mind, but then I can look away also. So when we say that this internal self is a knower, it's only when things are there to know. And we can only do that through the intellect. When we say that this is an experiencer or an enjoyer or a witness, it's only when there is something to witness. When the thing that is being witnessed is gone, no point in calling that a witness anymore. You get the idea of it. I see in the chat there's a question. Let me just pause a little bit. So it feels like the buddhi can observe the manas, and in meditation, how can we know if we have reached the meditative state or if we are just at the level of our buddhi? Well, have you ever been to New York? If you say yes, then it's an irrelevant question. If you say no, then the question is, how will you know when you're there? So when we talk about the knowledge, as opposed to what the knowledge seems, you take two extremes, always seem alike, by the way. So a mindless dullness of sleep, deep sleep, looks exactly the same as a person in samadhi. There's a story like that. So there were three people coming along, and a holy man had gone into the state of samadhi. And one person came along, he was reeling, he was drunk. The man must have had a lot of drink, and now he's fallen into a ditch. So such is the way of drunken people, and moves on. The other person comes along, and he sees this person by the side of the road, and he assumes that, he is sleeping because he's very tired. He himself is tired, and he assumes he must have sat there and to take a nap. But another person comes along, somebody who is already free, what we call Jivan Mukta, and he sees this person and recognizes the condition and takes him home and looks after him. So it feels like the buddhi can observe the manas. Yes, the buddhi does observe the rest of the mind, all the preceding koshas, all the preceding levels and functions and conditions of the mind. But it is only reflective, because when you come to look at the buddhi itself, there's another looking entity. And just to acknowledge that one thing straight away, to see how the intellect itself is working, how one day it is happy, one day it is miserable, one day it is decisive, one day it is indecisive. One day it interprets things in a factual way, another time it doesn't. Just the fact of looking at it will give a feeling, I am that witness. It may not last for very long. And when you train that more and more, become more used to it, it becomes more natural. But it is true. You can imagine that you're in a corridor, and on the one side is a whole lot of rooms all lit up. On the other side is one room that is flooded with light. And one standing in the middle, you have the capacity to see both sides. So when the intellect is purified to that extent, and seeing both sides, this condition is called savikalpa samadhi. That is a condition of samadhi that has the last condition there, the last condition to be removed. This is equivalent to being one with God. And then when that itself gets removed, then we sit in the other room with the full blaze of light. And there is no return, normally speaking. Normally speaking means that in that condition of the lighted room, the lit room, fully lit room, we call this Nirvikalpa Samadhi, nothing else is there. You cannot see any other room. And so from that point of view, sustained from the physical waking point of view for 21 days, this then becomes like the salt doll that enters into the ocean and does not return, it dissolves. So for somebody to enter into this condition and come back is a rare occurrence and indicates to us a rare kind of ever-free soul. So the mind and the organ of perception together constitute a unit which is called Manomaya Kosha, or the sheath of the mind. But the self, or the Atman, identified with it, assumes the characteristics of the mind and experiences this diversity of names and forms. But the test of it is, when all of that is gone through, say, meditation, then it stands alone. That is how we know that it is alone, stands alone. And we can go back into it also. Even for a moment in meditation, we can experience that. So in line with our interactiveness, I'm going to pause there and ask Dermot or ask the questioner whether that sheds some light of clarity on your question.
Thank you, Swami. It does. I'd have to. To be honest, I'll have to go back and look at it again. Hear it again, because there's a lot in it. What I find it hard to see things from sort of multiple points of view, which I think is implied by what I've heard.
All of it has no use unless we apply the practical principle and application to it. So spiritual practice is necessary.
Yes, that's partly. I know I'm vague about it because I'm not really sure what I'm saying, but part of it was about that, like whether the individual is self-activating, or whether at some stage that's whether it's I suppose it's like grace, what in regards to practice, like what part is down to the sort of individual effort, and what part is down to grace. How can we, I know I'm using sort of words like inside and outside and self and other and that, so I'm not really sure of the assumptions of my own words.
Okay, so the two questions are there, but firstly, so the one question, I'm not sure how it was phrased, but I can give you the answer and you'll understand in the context of your question. So what is most helpful is to get out of the head and into the heart. So when we start analyzing and overanalyzing these things and intellectualizing these things, we broaden the disparity between the principle and the practice. If you had a contest between the head and the heart, or between emotion and thinking, then emotion would always win. And so that can be a positive thing. The positive thing about it will be that when we catch this emotion up, supposing we have the intellect as big and the feeling as very small, there's a disparity. Supposing the emotion is big and the intellect is small, there's a disparity. So first we have to understand the principle of something, just as a foundation. a kind of toolbox that we can apply and use. An A to Z toolbox. We don't have to take every tool in the toolbox. Now, to guide us in terms of catching the emotions up to it. That is the practice. And so in terms of that, we have to take not only scripture, but use scripture as a meditation. Yesterday we were talking about the Upanishads, that is the base of Vedanta, and this is a question and answer session on Vedanta. But every one of the Upanishads is there, ripe and ready and open for meditation. A section in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad tells us about the Antaryaman, the inner controller. Yesterday there was a question with regard to where is the room for Ishvara? Well, this Ishvara is Antaryaman, the inner controller. So the inner controller is there all the time. Before this earth stood, we have to examine what was there before. We can take on board the scientific point of view that there were whirling gases, hot gases, and eventually there was a condensation until we get a solid matter with a kind of plasma around it, that kind of thing. It's okay, we can take that. If it happened in that way, so be it. But before, what was there? An entity stood there and wove, as it were, if you use your poetic imagination, a cocoon around itself. That became the earth. Now you can do that with every single example of everything we see at a fundamental level. We can do it with fire, we can do it with water, we can do it with air, any kind of component we can do it with. You can do it with the sun, you can do it with the moon. Before the sun was there. This is a formula that is used in a conversation with Yajnavalkya in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, where questions are fired left and right. The background to this is that there was a great assembly of all the wise people in the courtyard of the sage Janaka. And King Janaka was a wealthy king. He offered 1,000 cows and said, here's some silver attached to your hoofs, so that when these cows become barren, you can still look after them. You can make a retirement home for cows if you like, but 1,000 cows is a huge, huge gift of wealth. I'll offer this to the wisest person among you. Yajnavalkya said to his disciples, come, take these cows. Nobody's claiming them. And there was a big uproar. It's not the mark of a wise person to declare they're wise. So then they all made a big fuss and a bother and said, you declare you're wise, see, and you take the cow. How can you do that? And then he wisely turns the question around and says, well, if you're the wisest, then prove that you are wise. Otherwise, I'll take the cows. We'll put it back on them. Burden of proof came to those who are objecting. And so that starts a whole dialogue of questions. And each one of these answers, repeated because of its importance, are centered around this concept of Antaryam, inner controller. Now, when we now start to understand in a meditative way what this means, we have to attach feeling. Meditation has no value unless there's feeling. Feeling has to be attached to it because feeling enhances meaning. And when we then put this in, we start catching up the emotions to the principles. And now we're actually practicing the principles. They are no longer abstract concepts. We have to take ourselves out of the head and into the heart and see if we can catch this up through spiritual practice. I think you understand that also. Hence your request earlier. That's okay. If it's very simple when we go through the very basic principles of the Vedanta. To understand through various examples how we have gotten into a condition where the complete unlimited appears to be limited. But when we go through the meditation practice, we realize nothing is limited. It only seems to be like that. And so every aspect that we take as real, every functional part is simply an avenue. It's simply an adapter, an expressive adapter that we call upati. The intellect is like that also. So taking for granted that we make these wrong identifications, we can use these identifications, and instead of there being an ego that is unripe and selfish, we can be open channel for God's grace. Second part of your question is like this. In terms of this practice, then our small effort is matched by a divine movement towards us. And this is what we call grace. So Sri Ramakrishna gives a beautiful example about that. He says, the wind of God's grace is ever blowing. We have but to set our sail. Now, setting a sail, if you've ever done any sailing, is not as easy as it sounds. But compared to the wind's effect and movement and power, it's very small. Small effort is required. A small opening is required. You can use another example. Supposing there is a small opening somewhere, and beyond it is the sunlight. Where I'm sitting under a skylight. That means there are patches of sunlight here and there. Supposing the sunlight is a metaphor for this glorious Brahman, all shining, ever pure, existence itself, consciousness itself, bliss itself. Then if I want to see the full glory of it, what will I have to do? Well, I can take the whole roof off. I can take it off in sections. That's the wiser thing to do, get more sunlight in. Ultimately, I'll take the whole roof off. But when I take the whole roof off, the full glory of the sun comes shining through. So what we call God's glory and interpret as a movement toward us is actually just a question of removing the obstacles in the way. You remove the obstacles in the way, the full glory is there, self-evident, self-luminous by itself. It's shining, all things shine, says the Upanishads. Tameva bantam. So all things shining, it shines. So it's a useful analogy to use. The same thing with the previous analogy of God's grace is sitting behind. Let's use an analogy of water restrained by a dam. And then we open the gateways. We receive a flood. We didn't have to go and fetch water with a teaspoon from one side to the other, or a cup or a bucket. That would be a laborious thing to do. But spiritual life begins with that misunderstanding, that we have to do something. Yes, but what is it doing? Only removing obstacles, only taking away the obstacles, and then seeing the use of the limiting adjuncts. So you can use it as soon as Gautama Siddhartha became Buddha. He didn't stay in that Buddhist state in a transcendent way, not at all. He used it for expressing his enlightened intellect everywhere. And from there came Buddhism. So people listened to him. He taught. He taught in the parks, initially in the great park, which is there, in the area of Kashi, the deer park. And from there went on. What impelled him to do it? So sharing everything everywhere, his upati, that we call ego, became ripe, and he became an open channel for divine grace to flow everywhere. Allowing other people also to access their inner nature, their inner Buddha, if you want to call it like that, or even if you want to use a negative expression, instead of saying samadhi, you can say nirvana, or nibbana in Pali. But nirvana is not a term exclusive to Buddhism. You'll find it in several places in the Bhagavad Gita. But the addition is there. Nirvana, Brahma. So it is associated with this existence. It's not a non-existence. It's not a shunya. It's not a void. It's not an emptiness. It's the opposite. It's a fullness. But from our point of view, it looks like an indescribable void. How can you describe the indescribable? And the best we can do is to say it is existence itself, consciousness itself, and bliss itself. Naturally, that'll come through in a reflected way in the intellect and in everything else, every other manifested form of it.
Swami, would I be right in thinking then that on a sort of more practical level, that it's about that we misidentify by pursuing our likes and dislikes, whereas that means then that we're fragmenting from the wholeness and the fullness of things by pursuing sort of like the way an alcoholic reduces everything around drink. So that's what he's identified with. So therefore he's going to fragment his family on a practical level, because that's what he's going to pursue.
Yes, if you're an alcoholic, the worst thing to do is to go into the pubs, isn't it?
Yeah.
So the simple solution is several. You have to saturate the mind with better thinking. And what that better thinking is a way of revaluing the world. We start off by revaluing the world itself. So Vedanta has a fourfold method. The fourfold method would be, but having a strong desire for the truth is the first thing. Without that prerequisite, nothing comes. So same thing in the practical side, same meditation. No point in taking up the principle of meditation if you do not have a thirst for it. Same thing with anything in life. So there has to be a strong desire. But then there also has to be a way of looking at the world in a different way to evaluate it more properly. A reevaluation is necessary.
So then does that mean then that when maybe the first thing to meditate on would be to generate the desire for the truth in the first place? That would be the...
Well, we have to artificially do it. If it's not coming naturally, we have to artificially manufacture. And we do that by putting ourselves in a good environment, putting ourselves in holy company, and all the tools that are given to us in the form of teacher, mantra, scripture, and all of that. Self-discipline is necessary as well. So there has to be that strong desire. And if that desire is not continuously with us, then we have to manufacture it by putting ourselves in a better environment and learning scripture-based ways of looking at things. Instead of seeing a tree as a tree, we can see it as a wonderful miracle. If you and I try to hold our arms up for 100 years, we can't do it. A tree manages to do it. So what is the wonder that we see as a tree? So it starts out with observation, acute observation of life. You're not bypassing the things that we take for granted. We take for granted when you look at a tree, oh, tree, shrug the shoulders, move on. No, it's not just a tree. It's a miracle because that tree came from a seed. The whole of the tree was in it. How is it that that seed evolves into a tree? The only thing that was provided was the environment. Same thing in spiritual life and spiritual growth. We have to make sure that our environment is conducive to growth. A tree, a flower, none of these things will grow unless the water is there, proper air, proper climate, nutrients in the soil, all of these are there. Fortunately, they're all supplied to us. It's just that we have to take advantage of it. Instead of blocking our out the environmental helps, we have to take them on board. Scripture, we have to take on board. Teacher, we have to take on board. Mantra, we have to take on board. Meditation, we have to take on board. In fact, all the yogas, we have to take on board. We have to take karma yoga on board. We have to take bhakti yoga on board. We have jnana yoga on board. And dhyana yoga, meditation also we have to take on board. One without the other is really not using our full faculties, because in the mind we have a willing capacity, we have a thinking capacity, we have a feeling capacity, and we have the capacity to harmonize things through meditation. This is a balanced life. We can't be one-sided. So if we take care, understanding that we have a particular addiction, the addiction is highlighted for us individually in the Enneagram. So we take that particular addiction that we have and make sure that we're not nurturing it. This is called spiritual practice. But that only gives us maintenance, bare maintenance. We have to do a little something extra so that every day becomes some kind of even marginal intensification of our spiritual practice. We have to saturate the mind with the quality of purity and truth, sattva. And we do that through continuously thinking, because all of our difficulties are because of wrong thinking. Right thinking changes it. This is why if we talk about Buddha, you see, the Eightfold Path is all to do with right occupation, right thinking, right meditation. See, right this, right that. And that's another way of saying that all our movements and activities have to be saturated with this quality of purity and sattva in practice. That automatically then removes all the doubts and fears. Automatically, it does it. Just as in the same way that if I want to conquer a shadow, then I can't swear at it, I can't attack it, I can't shoot it, I can't ambush it. But if I face the sun and walk toward it, it follows me obediently. So Ramakrishna gives us fourfold simple formula. What he says is that continuously sing the glories of the divine on the basis that if I see a tree and I go into a rapture about the beauty and origin of the tree, if it leads me to a condition where I see more than just tree, then it leads me to a sense of appreciation. And that appreciation leads me to a sense of thankfulness. And going through that, every cell of the body thrills with it. I become elated. There's an internal rapture that I go through in my whole life. And every moment is an opportunity to do it. A blank check has never been used before. I can fill it with something new and something glorious. And play a game like that, the game of guiding thought. What we call meditation. You see, this coming weekend is a course on meditation. I subtitle it, The Game of Guiding Thought. Meditation is a game of guiding thought that gives us an internal shift, an internal movement, and opens us more and more and more, just like any restriction to sunlight can be opened just a little bit, a little bit, a little bit. The whole roof comes off eventually. And then the full glory is self-expressive. So that's the idea about it. So I see one hand up for a question. Whose hand is up? Let me just see. Oh, Brendan, your hand is up. Yeah. So please go ahead, take the microphone.
Hello, Swamiji. Hello, everybody. Good morning and good afternoon now, actually. And it's wonderful to be here with you. And I've been very interested in Vedanta for the last 10 years or so. And when you were speaking about feelings, Swamiji, and moving towards the heart, my thoughts on that were that feelings are not facts, and that the mind, a bit like when we're born, like a new laptop, basically starts to take in data, you know, depending on the environment in which you're born. Obviously, the data about initially is your mother, your father, your family, and then wider community and school and all that sort of thing. We don't necessarily have a lot of influence over the years about the data that we're bringing in. It can be cultural as well. If I was born rather than in Ireland and I was born in Singapore, obviously the data that has come in is different. And I wonder in terms of then when it comes to meditation, or I've tried to practice mindfulness and stuff like that, in becoming the observer of that data and looking at the reality of the data that we have. And Vedanta also, as I've experienced it, also underpins some of the philosophies with science, like the quantum split experiment, where it's only under human observation that things become atomic. You know, these are the things that you know, for me, the data that's in this thing I call mind, you know, is so influenced that a lot of it I've had to unlearn. And you know, the idea that feelings are not facts and thoughts are not facts, that moving back into the observer of the body or the mind, you know, and trying to, in spiritual practice, move towards reality, then just the issue that arose for me there is it through grace then that I can figure out the feelings that are facts or not? I hope that's not too confusing, but that's how crazy I could be. Sorry.
So every age will have used its own similes. And since we're in a computer age, we tend to use the same similes. Mm-hmm. So using computer similes of data and so on and so forth. Okay. Mm-hmm. The thing is, it's not like a computer at all. Except in the accumulation of our experience. And that then goes into a realm, you can, if you want to use computer language, into the memory bank, if you like. And that is then called in psychology, the subconscious or the unconscious mind. But that has an attractive force to it, that has a suction to it. And so our spiritual life in a psychological way will be to reform the unconscious mind. We can never do it directly. And so the only thing we can do is we can make sure that the conscious mind that contributes to it, see, the data input will come from the outside. It'll be validated as real. And the response to it is also real. So when you can't say to somebody, your sadness is unreal. Your sadness is real. Your sadness is factual. Within the context, it's factual. This is maybe relatively so, but we can't dismiss it. We can observe it. And in observing it, two things happen. One is that we see a kind of wave-like behavior. Something comes up, something has its life on stage and disappears, and there is some witness to it. And that itself, for a moment, will give us an insight into our own true nature. But how to sustain that? That's the thing. And the only way you can sustain it is by continuously taking the mind that has many parts, but let's say the official word for it really is antakarana. To think of it in this way, that is an internal instrument. And the internal instrument will have all these various different parts. And one of the reactive parts will be the feelings and emotions. So how to control that? You can't control that unless you saturate the mind with more positive things. Any addiction will have the same formula. You don't get rid of something, you don't repress something, you don't suppress something. You simply fill up with something better, something else. Instead of saying, what a pity, you say, what a glory. And you continue with that. And this has been broadly called positive thinking. But it's much more than that. It's elevating thinking. It's reevaluating thinking. So the world as such has a reality to it. We can't say it has not. What we see in front, though, as fragments in space and time, is equivalent to fragmented God. We have to put in seemingly, because that entity can never be broken up or fragmented, so seemingly so. But you see, it is like this. Now, I drew this yesterday, or part of it, so I'll see if I can do it. I'll take a board that doesn't have so much sunlight on it. So we start up here. We start up here with an absolute that is not an observer, because there's nothing to observe. If it's absolute, it's absolute. No coming, no going. You can't describe any absolute. So we just take it as an abstract entity. Of course, there are ways to symbolize it. We say there's air, and air has no limits. Yeah, we can understand kind of unlimited as a concept of that. You want to sit down and think, okay, supposing I want to try and conceive of infinity, then I'm stuck with a sea or a blue sky or something like that, or space. Some concept has to be there, which is conditioned. Now, all our experiences, you quite rightly said, these are all in the realm. So let me put this in, because I'm away from the computer going back and forth. It might be easier just to use my microphone for this. Yeah. So all the experience that is accumulated, this is all the baggage that we accumulate. All the data, and our system says not just from this life also. So we come with a kind of base, and then all our experience is added to. These are called samskaras. Samskara means every action that we do, every thought, every impression has its corresponding echo in the unconscious mind. These are unconscious impressions. It is these impressions that come out inevitably as another reaction. So how to reform that so that it is useful to us and revealing to us? Well, we have to put new impressions in, which are on the pure side, the sattvic side, the illuminating side, thinking things in a much more revalued and positive way. So it's like if you have a thorn in your foot, then you have to take it out with another thorn. We have to use the feelings. We have to use the thinkings. We have to use all of these things that philosophy tells us are relegated to a kind of dream world, an ephemeral world, relative world. Well, that's all good philosophy, but it doesn't help me construct a table. I can't say to a carpenter, please take all the quantum elements and make a table. Or by the way, it's all in a dream, or it's unreal. That has no value for a carpenter. So I have to have enough flexibility to be able to shift my position and say and deal with things which are appropriate. So on the realm of the absolute will only be experienced when as an absolute, say as a witness, when other things are present. And so from the absolute, we have a way of using what we call a party, a limiting factor. We can call that Maya. Maya. This absolute plus this limiting adjunct called Maya comes nature itself, Prakriti. It contains three evolutionary elements in it. We call these Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. Now, so far it's unmanifest because the thing that is manifest or identified is something that is not in equilibrium. It requires some ruffling to say, oh, something exists. So a ruffling has to be there. And we can say that there is an element of creation, an element of preservation, an element of destruction. These three elements have to be there, or dissolution. There's some ruffling has to be there to say, yeah, we recognize this in our conditioned sense. So the next thing then is we have cosmic mind. We previously referred to this as buddhi. We also call it mahat. It's the great thing. And it can roughly equate to personal God. And it has a creative capacity, and from there all these other things come. We have 5 subtle elements, 5 subtle forces. Now, if you want to use quantum physics, this is all in quanta. And so it goes on, and there's an individuality there. We can call it all egos are there also. And these bifurcate in different ways. I won't go into that for shortage of time. So these 5 things present us with some boundary, some border, but it's only an imaginary border, really. And so we call this in quantum physics decoherence. This is all coherence because these are all waves. Or at least they have wave-like behaviors. And when they combine and recombine, as seen by us, they become the world of 5 objects, gross objects, only our interpretation of it, and 10 sense organs. And we react on the basis of how well we interpreted all of this. And so along with this, we also have mind. 16 components are there. Now, the observer effect that you're talking about is not necessarily a human observer. That's a very controversial thing to say. If you want this to be a philosophical thing along these lines and so on, and say there's only one consciousness and so on, then you put in human conscious observer. But otherwise, if you want to be purely scientific, you have to say anything interfering with the wave structure will give us, at a certain level, will give us all of this worlds of trees and flowers and tables and chairs and bodies and animals and insects. So how to get back to this understanding here? This, in association with this, provides us with a witness. And we understand that when we see that all of this is compounded into 3 states of consciousness: waking, dream, and dreamless sleep. But some fourth is there as a witness. So that witness standing there, how do we get back to that? We have to revalue all these other states of consciousness. And in order to do that, we have to, instead of approaching this whole thing with this one component of the mind, which is to do with self-identification, ego. In other words, this has identified with this in some way. Then you have to separate this identification step by step. All right, how do we do this? We do this by following Jesus' formula. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Because all of this is a wave system, and the whole of the mind is a wave system. Something like waves in a lake. And waves in the lake stop us from seeing what is at the bottom, that is static. If there are waves in the lake, it stirs up all the mud and what have you. We have to be able to see what is there. So we take advantage of these evolutionary forces, because all our difficulty is because of these 2 elements, this projection and this hiding. The truth is hidden from us in 2 ways. There's a hiding element to it, and there's a projecting element to it. And so the examples for this whole thing are contained within the whole principle and philosophy of Maya. And that is that there is a projecting element, and that is all put together in a story form, that in the twilight of the evening, I go out and I see something coiled up and I project onto it. It is a snake. And then in the lamp, with the lamp of wisdom, I reveal, oh, it is actually a rope coiled up. The rope was hidden from me, and I projected a snake which wasn't there. And then a lamp of enlightened intellect revealed to me. In other words, a mind that is saturated with the quality of sattva, purity and goodness and so on, reveals to me the fact of it. So that nature has these three components to it. And the formula is very simple. I saturate the mind with all the moral and ethical values. And what is my definition of that? Selflessness. Supposing somebody is completely, sincerely truthful and utterly selfless, they will come to realize this straight away. Well, not straight away, progressively, hopefully. Straight away means if I discover it one day, I'll have a military coup against it the next day. So there's an advantage to doing it progressively. Now, what is useful to us in doing this? Imagination. Since we have formed an imaginary world with all the data that you're mentioning, our neutralizing factor would be provoking the imagination, that is promoting feelings. It is all our doubts, all our fears, all our temptations are because of evoked feelings about it that culminate in the sense of fear. So what is our counter movement? Our counter movement is to make the emotions, to raise up the emotions and steer them in a confident way. And we can do that in a delightful way. And we do that naturally when we see the truth of something. Instead of, in the example, seeing just as just a tree, we then see the beauty and glory of the tree. And when we do that, we bring it back to its pristine root, the absolute, or as near as we can interpret it. And in doing this repeatedly, is called spiritual practice. The spiritual practice is cleaning the mind. Cleaning the mind, making it pure, making it sattvic, making it illumined. This was the original question. How do we make the mind, how do we make the confusion between the light and the thing that is lit, the light and the lamp? In summary, that was the original question. Well, the light is the light, the lamp is only its adapter. But by making sure that the adapter is clean, it will reflect the light more and more and more. And when it's until only the light is there and the intellect is no more in use. Now, this is a long, hard procedure, of course, because how to convert all the data that we have. And if we compile it all and say it was all a mistake, it's wrong data, then we have to fill it with the correct data. So feelings should not be dismissed. Feelings are the way, the avenue, the principal avenue. This is the importance of devotional life. It's like the mind is a cloth, and we dip it into a magic solution, and in that magic solution is dye, and whatever dye we put it into, or you can have tubs of different dyes, whatever we put our white cloth into, it comes out that color. So we have to be careful where we dip the cloth of the mind. See, some people used to think that the laundered cloth, which takes the color of the dye, is a very pessimistic outlook. It doesn't give us much hope. And some people would say that you can only be absolutely pure when this cloth of the mind is plunged into the thought of God to take God's color. So there's nothing particularly encouraging about that approach. But you see, this purification is only 3/4 of the battle. When it's accomplished, spiritual realization comes spontaneously. You could take it in that way. Or you can take it in a different way. That the average mind, which is crowded with all these worldly thoughts and all this data that you're mentioning, and contradictory thoughts and feelings, so averse to the thought of God, it can be purified like a laundered cloth, but the mind, in whatever condition it may be, will take on the color. The much more positive interpretation of that. So any average mind can take on a spiritual color. Dip the mind in God, see what happens. All right. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto all.